Wow. Thank you for being so respectful to Dinesh, since he's up on our turf here now. Last two of our debates, this is the rubber match, the best 2 out of 3 here. He won one, I won the other one, so today's the tiebreaker. And I was largely on his turf before, and everybody treated me with respect. So, and thank you, Harvey Papel, the host of Athens and Jerusalem, for co-hosting today, and of course for Tom for normally doing my job, and to Bill for moderating. So just to see how much the turf is slanted one way or the other, how many of you would consider yourselves to be believers in a God of any kind, any personal sort of God? Okay, it's still a sizable, wow, still a sizable majority, I would say. I understand where you're coming from. I was a born-again evangelical Christian. I matriculated at Pepperdine University to major in theology, and we did the evangelical door-to-door thing, which we called Amway with Bibles. You know, you're out there pitching, and then I went through in my 20s my switch around and became sort of a born-again atheist, and went around knocking at those same doors and said I was wrong about that other thing I was telling you. Which sort of reminds me of what you get when you cross a Jehovah's Witness with an atheist, and that's somebody who knocks on your door for no reason at all. And then I saw a bumper sticker that I think maybe captures where I'm at now. It said, militant agnostic, I don't know and you don't either. A theist knows there's a God. An atheist, or at least the strong version of an atheist, knows there is no God. As Woody Allen said, to you I'm an atheist, to God I'm the loyal opposition. It depends what we mean by these terms, and agnostic was originally coined in 1869 by Thomas Huxley to mean simply that it's unknowable in any scientific rational sense, and I suppose in that sense, as a statement of the universe, well, nobody knows. Militant agnostic. Agnostic seems to be a right word about what we know about the universe, and the problem with that word, of course, is it's loaded, like all words are. Stephen Colbert said an agnostic is just an atheist without balls, and so I'm not crazy about that word either, and so a non-theist seems like a fairly neutral word. I guess I'm just going on about this because of the so-called new atheism, and that word keeps coming up, and I suppose, like Woody Allen, I would convert if only God would give me some clear sign, like making a large deposit in my name in a Swiss bank would do it. And of course, that gets us to the question of sort of the empirical nature of some of these claims. Although we're not debating God's existence here, on a deep level it does matter, because it isn't likely that anyone would argue for Christianity being good for the world or any other religion if they didn't also believe it was actually true. Not just psychologically true or true for me, but actually true. And that's when we get into that fuzzy area between, well, how do we know it's true? And that's where you get some blending between science and religion. And to that extent, atheism really isn't a thing. Neither is secularism. You see the conservative talk show hosts are always talking about the atheists want to convert America to a secular nation. Like a secular thing is a thing. It's simply a word that means without religion. And America is a secular government in that sense. There's no religious test for who's a citizen or not. At least there shouldn't be. And that's where it gets kind of heated and political. So to that extent, I'm not making a case for secularism or atheism, because it's just a default position you begin at and then build on from there with something else. And I'm not even arguing for science as a belief system, because it isn't. It's just a tool for understanding the way the world works. If you want to get a spacecraft to Mars, you're better off using astronomy rather than astrology, say, something like that. It works, and that's why we use it. And so to that extent, science depends on natural explanations for a phenomenon. And when we talk about God and miracles and the intervention and say, giving us moral laws and so forth, at some point then the deity steps into our universe and stirs up the particle. Somehow he intervenes. And also, although I make a joke about the large deposit in a Swiss bank, although that would be interesting, people do pray in the hopes of an intervention, and they typically pray for things that might have changed anyway. And that's why you see prayers for cancer, but you never hear or see prayers, or at least hear about them, for, say, growing a new limb. Why is that? Why? I mean, here we have all these soldiers who have bravely fought for our freedom in Iraq coming back missing limbs. Why does nobody pray for them to grow a new limb? Why can't God grow a new limb? A salamander can do it. Surely the creator of the universe could do it. And that's the problem where we get in trying to sort of determine an empirical basis for some of these claims. And the problem for a scientist for describing any of these things would be, how would you know that it was a supernatural intervention? How would you distinguish between a natural and a supernatural? So if we step back for a moment and say something slightly more neutral, like, is ESP real? Can people read each other's thoughts? And there's a theory about this, that the way they assume that it's true, this is Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's theory, that inside neurons are these little microtubules that hold the neurons together. Inside these tubules are these little vacuums in which you can get a quantum state, and the atoms all collapse the wave function in a particular pattern, and that's how thoughts get traversed across the distance from my skull to your skull, something like that. That's their theory. Now let's just say for a moment it turns out it's true. People can read each other's minds, and that's the explanation. Well, that's no longer now a paranormal phenomenon. That's just now neurophysics. And this is the fate of all these kinds of supernatural paranormal claims. They either get absorbed into a natural scientific explanation, or they just go away because there's no basis for the claim. So once you start pushing into some of these realms, this is what we're experiencing with science and religion, we end up in these gaps where you scientists have yet to explain X, and that's where we think the supernatural divine intervention came in. That may be, but what are you going to do, what are you going to claim when we do have an explanation for that, or the explanation simply, or the claim simply goes away with lack of evidence? So what we're faced with basically are two things we'll end up debating today, I know, because this is our third time and it always comes up, and that basically the two big last gaps, the origins of the moral sentiments, where our morality came from, and how do you explain the whole universe and the fine-tunedness, as Kant said, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. So when we have explanations for these, but they're not fully accepted by science yet, and that's where we end up having the great debates. So now, on to the specific question. The first one, is Christianity a force for good or evil? Well, it depends. Obviously, the answer is yes. It reminds me of my libertarian friends having these debates. Is government good or evil? Well, which part? And who? And what are they doing? And so on. And my answer, in short, I guess I would quote Winston Churchill's assessment of Americans. You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And in my opinion of religion, you can always count on religion to do the right thing after they've tried everything else in that sense. And so although it's an interesting debate, on the one hand, if you live in a secular government where there is no religious test for citizenship, and you have constitutions and bills of rights and protections of freedom, it really doesn't matter what somebody's religion is or what their beliefs are, as long as you have the freedom to think and disbelieve as you will. And the problem, though, of course, what we face is that too many religious people in the world today are not satisfied with that. The world is big enough for all of us to share in our different beliefs. To the religious mind, at least the absolutist or fundamentalist religious mind, where there is an absolute truth and we have it, and you must be converted to that, until every knee is bowed in submission, that's where we get into trouble with religious extremism. Now, when we say, is Christianity good, because we're not just talking about religion, I would even say, well, which one? According to the Oxford World Christian Encyclopedia, there's no less than 33,000 different Christian sects worldwide. So which one of those is the one that's good and which one of them is not so good? I mean, Protestant Christians determined to murder Catholic Christians over turf and politics in Northern Ireland? That's not good. Or Mormon Christians who belong to the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who believe that it's acceptable to force 13-year-old girls to have sex with men 5 times their age? That's not good. Or Pentecostal Christians who indoctrinate young children into becoming warriors for Christ through Jesus camps? That's not good. Evangelical Christians who believe so strongly in the sanctity of life that they blow up abortion clinics and kill doctors? That's not good. Or Catholic Christians whose priestly pedophile program of, in the words of Christopher Hitchens, no child's behind left. Also not good. So the problem, of course, is anecdotally, any of us can tally up side of good or evil, what side we're already on. We are by nature tribal and xenophobic, and so naturally any member of any group is going to remember, based on the confirmation bias where we look for and find confirmatory evidence for what we already believe and just ignore all the rest, we naturally can just remember all the good things our club did and the bad things the other group did. And so the question is, historically and scientifically, can we answer the question, is Christianity good or evil, and can we be good without God? Well, on the issue of slavery, I want to say something about that. I do think, upon Dinesh's recommendation, I rented Amazing Grace, the film about William Wilberforce and his drive to abolish slavery through illegal channels in England. And it's a terrific film, but what stood out for me was not the heroism of Christianity to end this blight on civilization, but that he stood out as so unusual amongst all his fellow Christians who would not go along with it for decades because they had financial interest in it, basically. But you can certainly picture how easy it would be to justify even something as extreme as slavery with biblical passages. For example, Colossians 4:22, slaves. You just picture yourself back in time. You're in a church, a Christian church in England, listening to the justification of slavery. Because in Colossians it says, slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing the Lord. Or 1 Peter 2:18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to the kind and gentle, but also the overbearing. So it's easy to pick and choose passages from the Bible that support what you currently believe, what the culture currently accepts as the morally right thing to do. But then what happens is there's a shift in culture for a whole variety of reasons, part of which is religion, but part of which I think has to do with other things, in which oppressed peoples just get tired of being oppressed and they stand up and fight back. Then some religious people may be on that side, and if they win, we call attention to them and make movies about them. But what about all the Christians at the time who opposed that? Now, slavery is sort of it's an old issue, but let's take a current one, and that is gay marriage and homosexuality as a case study. Now, it appears that a small percentage of the population, maybe 1 to 3%, I doubt if it's much more than that, are born preferring members of the same sex rather than the opposite sex. For whatever reason, it appears to have something to do with genetics and prenatal biochemistry and hormone balance and so forth. Asking a homosexual whether he or she chose to become gay is like asking a heterosexual, when did you choose to become straight? To which she'd be like, what are you talking about? I've always felt that way. And that is precisely, in fact, what gay people tell you when you ask them that. Nevertheless, on this particular issue, I think it's an example of Christianity still mired in pre-civil rights, pre-enlightenment, and even pre-scientific medieval thinking, basing their beliefs on a few biblical passages such as Leviticus 18, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, it is an abomination. Until you look at the passages on the either side in Leviticus, in which parents are instructed to kill their disobedient children and to execute adulterous wives and non-virgin brides. That's right, the death penalty for adultery, which would immediately eliminate a good number of Christian congressmen and senators, preachers and televangelists. And as a consequence of this embarrassing lapse of Christian charity and Jesus' doctrine of love for all humanity, Christian preachers, writers, theologians think nothing of tormenting gays by telling them that their desire to love another person of the same sex is an abomination, and by telling them that promiscuity is evil, but that the single best prophylactic against it, marriage, is legally banned from them, and then expect them to act accordingly. Christians actually believe they're being charitable when they say, well, we hate the sin but not the sinner, something like that. Joel Osteen was on CNN a couple weeks ago, in which the host, it wasn't Anderson Cooper, it was his fill-in, was interviewing him about, he's controversial because he's the wealth gospel, the gospel of wealth preacher, and Rick Warren, he of Purpose-Driven Life, who gives away most of his money, was critical of Osteen's emphasis on money. And anyway, so then they got into whether gays should be allowed into the church, and here Osteen made a big point about how ecumenical and liberal and open-minded he was by letting, in fact, encouraging gays to come to his congregation because we should open our arms to all sick and diseased people who need help. Still not really getting it, still seeing it as some kind of a sick disease. And anyway, so mark my words, here's what's going to happen. Here's my prediction. Within a decade, maybe 2, 3 at most, gays will earn all the same civil liberties as everybody else, and this will just be a bad chapter in American history. Looking at those pictures from the 50s of the black and white drinking fountains, it'll be along those lines like, gosh, I can't believe what people were arguing back in the 90s and the early 2000s. All of that will change, and of course, all the religious people will say, yes, of course, we were always right there with them. Maybe we didn't march in the gay pride thing in Hollywood, but, in any case, one final thought on that. Are we to believe that the biggest concern of the creator of the universe, the all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good deity capable of constructing stars and planets, complex life and consciousness and love, is what his biggest concern is what consenting adults do with their sex organs in the privacy of their bedrooms? This is it? Really? I mean, come on. Get over that. Okay. The logic of the belief that one's faith is the one true religion too often leads to a disturbing level of intolerance. And this intolerance includes the assumption that non-believers cannot be as moral as believers. We've seen in this last week with Mitt Romney's speech, this sense of Huckabee proclaiming, I am the Christian candidate, like the other guys are not Christian candidates, and of course Romney's got to give his speech. I thought there was no religious test for presidency or any other elected office or citizenship for that matter. Why does this keep coming up? And it keeps coming up because we are, in many senses, at least culturally, a Christian nation, and any member of the group thinks that they're special, and therefore if you're not a member, by the natural logic of xenophobia and our natural tribalism, anybody who's not a member of the group can't be as good by definition. That's true. Everybody does that, including, of course, atheists. So we have to watch out for that ourselves. And the Bible reinforces this idea. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works, and there is none who does good. Well, you want to know why the new atheists are sort of angry? Well, that's why. If you say we're better than you, that's going to irk people that are not a member of your club, and that's the reason for it. A recent talk a few months ago I gave, somebody sort of threw that at me in the Q&A, and I mean, this guy came up to me afterwards, right in my face, and it was in the deep South, so there was a lot of religious people there, so I wanted to be biblical in my response. So I said unto him, go forth and multiply yourself, but not in those words. I want to mention in closing my opening remarks one study done on this business of can you be moral. Obviously, we all know people that are not religious that are moral and people that are religious that are not moral, and vice versa. Easy to tally up the scores. If you go to George Barna's webpage, Barna is an evangelical Christian pollster who monitors religious changes and shifts and attitudes and opinions in America. Very, very highly respected. And by all of his data, there is no statistical difference between Christians and non-Christians or theists and non-theists on any of the moral criteria that they've evaluated there. So instead of giving you a big long data dump, since that just sort of washes over the brain, that just all those studies show that. In fact, there's no individual difference in society and socially, collectively as a group. I'll cite just one study and then wrap it up here. This last August in the Annals of Family Medicine, they published the results of a study conducted on 1,820 practicing physicians, looking at the relationship between their religiosity and how likely they were to serve the underserved. That is, how likely they would be to go practice amongst the poor. And the study was conducted by the University of Chicago and Yale University Medical Schools. And of course, the hypothesis was that as religiosity goes up, the numbers serving the poor would also go up. The study was directed by Farr Curlin, a medical doctor and a self-proclaimed evangelical Christian. His results were 31% of physicians who were more religious practiced medicine among the underserved, 31%, compared to 35% of atheist, agnostic, and non-religious doctors. This was not statistically significant, but that's my point. Being religious does not make you more likely to do that. He said, in fact, This came as both a surprise and a disappointment. The Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist scriptures all urge physicians to care for the poor, and of course the great majority of religious physicians describe their practice of medicine as a calling. Yet we found that religious physicians were not more likely to report practice among the underserved than their secular colleagues. And he did go on to say that there was a difference between whether you considered yourself a spiritual person or not. So religiosity and belief in God had no effect, but whether you considered yourself a spiritual person did. And then he has a discussion about how he thinks the church split over the last century between those who think that being religious means helping people and serving the poor and so on, and those who think religion means control of other people's individual behavior. And I think that's part of the great debate we're in now. And I'll end with this quote from, I think this sums it all up here, from Rabbi Hillel, in the first century CE, when asked what's the core of religious belief, he said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole law. The rest is commentary." Thank you.